Hello and welcome to VVork. I'm Brian Watrous. This is the 7th in a 10-part video series in which I'm teaching you how to automate with vRealize Orchestrator. Now, in the previous video, we started creating workflows that had input parameters. Actually, I only had one input parameter, but that started showing us what it's like to work with input parameters. We saw how to create an input parameter, and we actually saw how to bind to an input parameter, though we didn't go into a lot of detail about that. In this video, what we're going to be talking about is a concept known as parameter binding, which again, you did a tiny bit of that in the previous video. Now, I can't overemphasize how important this video is. Now, I'd like to think all the videos in this video series are great and insightful and terribly exciting to watch, but if there was one video that you need to master in order to become a good Orchestrator developer, it's this video, because the number one stumbling block that I've encountered with students and customers learning Orchestrator, the thing that stops them from being a good Orchestrator developer, the thing that leaves them frustrated if they don't understand it, is this concept called parameter binding. So watch this video once. Hopefully you'll get it the first time. If it takes watching it 2-3 times, keep watching it until you get it. Watch it, practice it, use it in Orchestrator, and one day you'll get a big aha moment and you'll understand not just how to do parameter binding, but why I'm emphasizing that it's so very important. Okay, so enough said. Let's actually move forward and take a look at our first slide here. So as you can see in the first slide, we're asking a fairly fundamental question. What is parameter binding? Well, parameter binding is the act of explicitly stating where you want each of your workflow variables to be accessible. Now, I'll pause for a moment to let that sink in. Don't worry if it doesn't totally make sense. Go ahead and rewind the video and play that again, or pause the video and look at the statement, but that's what parameter binding is. Now, I don't expect that you fully understand it just yet, so let's continue onwards. Now, one of the things that you need to do is to clearly separate in your mind two different concepts. The first concept is creating variables. Creating a variable is not the same thing as binding to a variable. So right from the start, think of those as two separate things. They both involve variables, but they're two different acts. So let's tackle the create variable part. To create a variable, you can do that using different tabs in the vRO client. There's the Inputs tab, that's used for creating input parameters. There's the Outputs tab, used for creating output parameters, and the General tab, which is used to create another type of variable called an attribute. So inputs is easy to remember, outputs is easy to remember, but try to file away in the back of your brain that there is no attributes tab, but rather you go to the General tab. So let's actually go into the lab environment. As you can see, I'm already logged into my vRO client. If you don't know how to do that, go back to video number 3. And in here, as you can see, I'm looking at a workflow. In fact, why don't we just create another workflow here? I'm going to right-click my Hello World folder, and I'm just going to create a new workflow. I'll call it New Workflow. Not a terribly exciting name, but good enough for our purposes here. And as you know, I'm a big fan of always typing a description. So this workflow is an example of creating variables, input parameters, output parameters, and attributes. To create an input parameter, we'll go to the Inputs tab. And again, when you create an input parameter, you click on the Add button. A new line appears each time you click that. So for instance, I've clicked it 3 times and I now have 3 lines. Each of these lines corresponds to an input parameter in my workflow. Now each input parameter has a default name. We expect that you'll change that to something more descriptive. So for instance, I might call this variable, let's see, just picking a fairly random name, we'll call this my variable. And I would do the same thing for each of these 3 input parameters. I would change their name to something more descriptive. I would then additionally set the type of the input parameter. If string is the type I want, I could just leave this alone, but if string is not the type I want, I click on whatever type it is, a window pops up, and in this window I can pick whatever type of data type I want. So for instance, maybe I want a number, or maybe I want a Boolean, or perhaps I want a complicated object such as a VC virtual machine. So regardless exactly what type I need, I can select from this list of hundreds and hundreds of types. But I'm going to keep things simple here. I'm going to hit cancel and simply go with string. Now with input parameters, we definitely need to type a label there because this is the prompt that the user is going to see when they run our workflow and we ask them for this input parameter. So remember, if only I could type, remember to type a description. Now that's obviously not what I would type in real life. You would type a description that helps the user to understand what you're asking for with this input parameter. And again, you do that with each of these input parameters. The Outputs tab works effectively the same way. Again, you hit the Add button, and you can add however many output parameters you want, name them, change their type a description for them, and then suddenly you have output parameters. So those input parameters will allow you to get information from whoever or whatever is calling your workflow. And the output parameters that we're creating here would enable us to send information out to whoever or whatever is calling your workflow. Now, that's how you create input parameters and output parameters, but there's this other tab labeled General. And in the General tab, if you scroll down to here, you can't quite see it on my screen, there's an Attributes section. So again, you can either scroll down or you can collapse this top part by hitting the triangle here. Just don't forget to uncollapse it because this will remain collapsed here in this workflow and all your workflows. So don't forget to uncollapse it. But going down to the Attributes section, the way you create attributes is essentially the same. You hit this time the button looks a little different, but it's another Add button. So we'll click Add Attribute. Each time we do, we get a new line. And once again, we can change the name to something better. So I'll choose a better name, set the type, and once again, set a description. And additionally, when you have an attribute, there are some other things that you can do. For instance, you can set the value of that attribute. You can make the attribute a constant by checking this checkbox. The little lock symbol here is to suggest that that's going to lock the value. Whatever value I type here is going to be locked. This no longer is a variable per se, but rather this attribute's a constant. Anyways, that's how you create these things called attributes. Now let's go back to our slide deck. So now we know how to create variables using the Inputs tab, Outputs tab, and General tab. Creating a variable is not the same thing as binding to a variable. Now, there are 3 different techniques for binding to a variable. There's a technique that involves some tabs labeled the In tab and the Out tab. In the previous video, you would have seen me, if you watched that, you've seen me use the In tab. We'll use that In tab and the Out tab again later on in this video series. That's one technique for binding. Another technique involves another tab called the Visual Binding tab. And there's a third technique called the Setup Wizard. All 3 of these techniques can achieve the same effects. They all allow you to bind parameters. I would recommend, as you're learning Orchestrator, that you learn them in this order. So learn how to use the In Out tab, then learn how to use the Visual Binding tab, and then the Setup Wizard is the one that you should probably wait to learn the last. I'm going to show you how to use all of these in the videos coming up, but again, I suggest you feel really comfortable with the In-Out tab approach and the Visual Binding tab approach before you start working with the Setup Wizard seriously. The reason why I say that is the Setup Wizard is a wonderful tool. It allows you to very quickly set up the bindings, but if you don't know what you're doing, you can unintentionally make a mess of your workflow very, very quickly. So learn the first 2 techniques, and then when you feel pretty solid with those, learn Setup Wizard. So again, I'm not going to show you right now how all these work because you'll see each of these techniques in the videos that follows. All right, so in the following slides, what I've done here is create some visual pictures to describe what's happening when you set up binding of parameters. Now, for instance, here in this screenshot, you can see I have a workflow, and my workflow has a schema. Let me grab my pointer here. That's this part here. My schema has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different schema elements. The first one and the last one are the start and end element. I'm just going to ignore those, and we're going to focus on these 3 schema elements that we see in the middle. Now, ultimately, these schema elements could be any type of schema element. They could be scriptable tasks. They could be workflow elements. They could be for each elements. They could be any type of element. All the different types of elements essentially allow you to do parameter binding. So we've got this workflow. It's got its schema. And in our workflow, as we just demonstrated, we can create input parameters. So let's create one input parameter. So watch over here. Here we go. 3, 2, 1. We created an input parameter. So we went to the Inputs tab, created an input parameter, and our input parameter in our workflow is called IN1, which is a good enough name for our purposes here. Now, after creating, this is very, very, very important to understand. After creating this input parameter in our workflow, the input parameter called in1, at this point, after creating the input parameter, not a single schema element can see that input parameter. None of them can access it. They can't see what's in that variable. They can't change the value of the input parameter in1. The schema elements have no way of accessing that variable. So that's where parameter binding comes into play. What we can do with parameter binding is explicitly state in which of these schema elements we want this input parameter, in1, the input parameter in our workflow. We get to state explicitly which schema elements we want in1 to be accessible from. So for instance, I'm going to use these little red lines with their arrows to indicate binding. I'm illustrating here a binding from the input parameter in our workflow called in1. And as you can see, following the red arrow, that in1 input parameter has been bound into schema element 1. And essentially what's happened as a result of this is there's now one schema element that knows that in1 exists. Schema element 1 knows that the input parameter in1 exists, and schema element 1 can see what's in the input parameter in1. I'll pause to let that sink in. Schema element 1 can see what's in input parameter in1. So that arrow was pointing into the schema element. So you'll hear me throughout these videos talking about bindings that are inward and bindings that are outward. Let's focus on inward bindings right now. What I just showed you was an inward binding. And what inward bindings do is they enable us to read the value that's stored in a variable. So for instance, we just saw a moment ago, here we go again, that we have an inward binding. As a result of this inward binding, in schema element 1 can see what's in input parameter in1. Schema element 1 can read the value that's in the input parameter called in1. Make sense? All right, let's continue onwards here. Now, I'm blowing up schema element E1 for a reason, and that's to make clear something that I haven't been quite entirely truthful about. I've been oversimplifying one important point for the sake of simplicity. Earlier, I said that we were binding input parameter in1 into the schema element E1. The reality is a little bit more subtle than that. What we're actually doing is not binding the input parameter to a schema element, but rather we're binding the input parameter to a variable inside the schema element. So let me pretend to create some variables inside the schema element. Don't worry about how we create them just yet. Just trust me, we've now got two variables in our schema element called local variable 1 and local variable 2. Now I chose those names for those variables to drive home a point, which is that variables within schema elements are local to the schema elements, which is a fancy way of saying that if you're outside of the schema element, you cannot possibly see what's going on with these two local variables. So local variables, variables that are defined inside your schema elements, are just local variables. They have no relationship to anything outside of the schema element. Now earlier, when I showed you the red arrow indicating the parameter binding, I drew an arrow from the input parameter of our workflow to the schema element 1. But in reality, what we'd be doing is creating a binding from the input parameter in our workflow, in 1, to a variable within the schema element, in this case, E1. Again, looking at the direction of the arrow here, this is an inward binding. So the binding is going into E1. It's an inward binding. And as a result, if we're in schema element 1 and we try to see what's inside local variable 1, what's going to happen is we're actually going to see the value that's in the input parameter called in1. In other words, this variable, local variable 1, which was formerly just a local variable, now allows us to see what's in the workflow variable called in1. All right, for the rest of this video, I'm going to, in order to keep the diagram simple here, I'm not going to explicitly draw or write the names of variables inside the schema elements. So let me shrink that one back down again. From here on out, again, we'll just do drawings like I did before. I'll remind you that there are variables inside the schema elements, but we're gonna keep the drawings a bit simpler here. So here we are back in our workflow, and as you can see, we have the ability in workflows to create input parameters. So let's create some. I've created 3 input parameters called in1, in2, and in3. At this point, as you know, none of the schema elements can see those input parameters. If we want the schema elements to see those input parameters, we would need to create a binding between the input parameters and variables within the schema elements. So, for instance, we might bind the input parameter, in1, to a variable that's defined within schema element E1. We might continue this process and set up a binding between the input parameter in2 and a variable that's defined within E2. Now those numbers happen to match right now. In1's going to schema element 1, in2's going to schema element 2. That's just a coincidence. There's no need for your input parameters and your schema elements to have the same number or be named the same or anything like that. To drive that point home, and another point too, let me add one more binding here. So notice that the input parameter in1 is bound to a variable in schema element 3. Those numbers don't match because they don't have to match. Another thing though that I want you to notice with this new binding, this one right here, the one I'm making blink, is that notice now that this input parameter in1 has been bound to 2 different schema elements. It's been bound to schema elements E1 and E3. And that's totally permissible. In fact, this is one of the things that parameter binding does for you, is it allows you to state explicitly exactly which of these schema elements you want to be able to work with a particular input parameter, or for that matter, output parameter or attribute. You get to pick and choose. So in this case here, in1 is visible in 2 of the schema elements, but not the one in the middle. I get to pick and choose. I get to be explicit. Now there's another thing that's being illustrated on this slide at this point. If you take a look at in3, you'll notice that I've set up no binding between in3, my workflow input parameter, and the schema elements. If you do that, if you fail to set up a parameter binding, when you validate your workflow, you will get an error. Actually, that's not quite true. When you do the validation, if you haven't done if you have an input parameter or output parameter or attribute that's not bound, you will receive a validation warning. I said error a moment ago, I meant warning, which means you could run your workflow and having a input parameter or output parameter or attribute that's not bound isn't going to hurt your workflow. It's not going to break your workflow. It's not going to keep your workflow from running. But having variables that you've defined but have never bound or used is I'll be a little harsher. It's sloppy, and we don't want to do that as Orchestrator developers. We want to have all the variables that we need, but not too many, and we want to have all the bindings that we need, but not more bindings than we actually need. And we also don't want to have situations like we have here, where I've got an input parameter in3 that I'm not using anywhere. Now, I've been talking about input parameters, but essentially everything I've been saying about input parameters is also true of output parameters, with just a little modification. Input parameters allow you to get information in from whoever or whatever is calling your workflow. Output parameters, as you already know, allow us to get information out of this workflow back to whoever or whatever is calling our workflow. But the mechanism for binding works essentially the same way. We would need to create an output parameter. We already talked about how to do that. And we would need to set up a binding. So in this illustration here, I've created a binding between a variable that's defined within schema element 1, and I've bound that outwardly to the output parameter called out1. So it works the same way, but behind the scenes, subsequently when you make use of these variables, the difference between inward and outward binding does have a pretty profound effect. So remember, an inward binding enables you to read the value that's stored in a variable. On the other hand, an outward binding enables you to change the value that's stored by a variable. You can change it. Or, in other words, you can write out a new value to the variable, to the output parameter. So, inward binding, you're going to be able to read what's in a variable. Outward binding, you'll be able to change what's in a variable. Now, there's a third type of variable we've mentioned before called attributes. Now, to understand attributes, quick reminder about input parameters and output parameters. Those input parameters and output parameters allow us to get information into and out of a workflow. On the other hand, attributes are values that are inside your workflow. In other words, if you are outside your workflow, you can't see the attributes. Attributes can be used for a variety of purposes, but one of the main purposes of attributes is they allow you to pass data around inside of your workflow. So for instance, if I want to pass a value from schema element 1 to schema element 2, or for that matter, from schema element 1 to schema element 3, they don't have to be right next to each other. If I want to pass some piece of data between different schema elements, I can do that through attributes. So let's take a look at some examples here. I've created now 4 different attributes. In other words, I went to the General tab, scrolled down, and created these 4 attributes called ATTR1, ATTR2, 3, and 4. These are attributes defined in our workflow. Now, for each of those attributes, I can do the same sorts of bindings that we've been talking about. And again, I can do inward bindings, just like you can with input parameters, plus I can do, if I want to, outward bindings, just like I can with an output parameter. That's one thing that's fundamentally different about attributes. Input parameters and output parameters only let you bind in one direction, but attributes allow you to bind inwardly and outwardly. But let's consider attribute 1. I'm illustrating a binding here. This is an inward binding because the arrow is going into the schema element. And what I'm illustrating with this inward binding arrow is that I've now set up schema element 1, or more accurately, a variable in schema element 1, so that that variable in schema element 1 can read what's in ATTR1. If I want to, I can use that same attribute multiple places. So for instance, this binding here again is another inward binding. This time it's to a variable in schema element E2. And as a result of that inward binding, now in both schema element 1, E1, and schema element E2, in both of those schema elements, I can read from the variable that I bound to, and in both cases, what I'll actually be seeing is the value that's stored in ATTR1. Let's keep going. I've got another attribute called ATTR2, and as I've just illustrated with this red arrow, you'll notice that the arrow is going the opposite direction because this time I'm illustrating an outward binding. By setting up an outward binding between a variable defined in schema element 2 and my workflow attribute called ATTR2, what I've done is I've given schema element 2 the ability to change the value of ATTR2. With ATTR2, if I want to, I can do an outward binding from one schema element and an inward binding to another schema element. And effectively, if I've done the bindings this way, what I'm able to do is to pass information now between schema element E2 and schema element E3. If schema element E2 wants to, it can write a value out to ATTR2, and then schema element 3 can read what that value is. Now in this particular diagram, schema elements 2 and 3 are right next to each other, but there's no requirement that they be right next to each other. I could have, for instance, schema element E2 outwardly bound to ATTR2, and then have an inward binding to some other schema element that's 100 schema elements away from that same ATTR2 schema element, workflow attribute. All right, continuing onwards here. Notice I've skipped attribute 3, kind of like I skipped input parameter 3. Just like skipping input parameter 3, never doing a binding to it, never doing a binding to ATTR3 would produce a validation warning. So in general, you don't want to do that. If you're not using an input parameter or you're not using an attribute, if you're not binding them to anything, then you probably ought to simply delete them. So here we have attribute 4. With our latest arrow, attribute 4 has an inward binding into E3, so into a variable in E3. So within E3, if we reference that variable, if we try to see what's inside of it, we can. But what we'll be seeing is the value that's actually in this workflow attribute called ATTR4. Whew, that's a mouthful. All right, again, at any point, pause, rewind. I know that parameter binding is a bit when you first start doing this, but I'm trying to be as explicit as possible and hit as many points as possible so that we can have one definitive video here that we can turn to look at again and again and again until you get parameter binding. All right, so what the heck? One more arrow here. Now I have an inward binding to attribute 4 and an outward binding to attribute 4. So schema element within schema element 3, I can see what its value, what the value of ATTR4 was, and change it if I want to. Okay, so that takes us to the end of this video. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this entire video. Again, it is a super important concept, this thing called parameter binding. So if need be, rewind the video, watch it again and again, hit pause at various points, but really do, if you can, take some time to try to get the concept of parameter binding, because it is tremendously important for your career as an Orchestrator developer. All right, so that is the end of this particular video. In the next video, we're going to be taking a look at how we can do fancier things now that we understand parameter binding. So maybe go take a coffee break or take a nap or something, but do come back and see you later in video number, actually this was 7, so the next one would be video 8. See you over in video 8.